December 31st, 1970, Congress hands the American automotive industry a death warrant. They didn't ask for a gradual improvement in gas mileage. They didn't ask for a slow transition to cleaner air. They handed down an ultimatum: cut tailpipe emissions by 90% within 5 years. If Detroit couldn't hit that mark by the 1975 model year, the federal government would effectively shut down every assembly line in the country. Detroit's response? They didn't go back to the drawing board. They didn't redesign the combustion chamber. They bolted on a pump. That single panicked decision, choosing a $3 Band-Aid over real engineering, would destroy American automotive performance for an entire decade. It would turn legendary muscle cars into literal boat anchors and hand the keys to the kingdom to Japanese manufacturers who were actually willing to innovate. This is the story of how a quick fix for pollution actually made the world a dirtier, slower, and more frustrated place. In 1970, the Clean Air Act wasn't a suggestion, it was an industrial earthquake. Engineers were given 4 years to solve a chemical problem that usually took a decade to research. The government called it technology forcing, which was just a polite way of saying, figure it out or go out of business. Every lead engineer in Detroit knew what the real solution required. They needed electronic fuel injection to replace the primitive carburetor. They needed computer-controlled ignition to manage the spark. But the bean counters told them there was no time and even less money. So they reached into the back of the parts bin and pulled out a relic from 1966 California-only cars. They called it the Smog pump. The concept was simple and devastatingly crude. Think of it as an afterburner for your car, but without any of the speed. Under normal conditions, an engine is supposed to burn all the fuel inside the cylinder. But 1970s carburetors were dumb instruments. They frequently dumped more fuel into the engine than it could handle. This resulted in raw, unburned hydrocarbons traveling out through the exhaust valves. To mask this, Detroit used the Air Injection Reactor system. A belt-driven pump would blast fresh, oxygen-rich air directly into the red-hot exhaust manifold. When that fresh oxygen hit the raw fuel in the hot pipe, the fuel would ignite for a second time. It worked, on paper. It burned off the toxins before they hit the atmosphere. But in the real world, it created a mechanical nightmare. Engineers hated the smog pump from day one. They knew it was a parasite. Because the pump was driven by a belt connected to the crankshaft, it took physical energy to move that air. That was energy that used to go to your rear wheels. On a standard 350 V8, that pump alone could steal up to 7 horsepower just to stay spinning. But that was only the first link in a chain of destruction. The extra heat of that afterburn was so intense it changed the metallurgy of the engine bay. Exhaust manifolds began to glow red-hot under normal driving conditions. This heat soaked into everything nearby. It melted vacuum lines. It baked alternator bearings until they seized. It turned high-performance engines into ticking bombs of warped metal and brittle plastic. If you want to see the internal memos where the men in white coats warned management that these fixes would kill the American car, subscribe and join us. We're tracking the mechanical choices that turned the 1970s into a graveyard for performance. In the executive boardrooms of Michigan, the decision was already made. Speed was a luxury they could no longer afford. But the pump was just the first domino. To meet the new laws, Detroit had to address nitrogen oxides, and that meant lowering combustion temperatures. The easiest way to do that was to kill the compression ratio. In 1970, a high-performance V8 ran at 11-to-1 compression. By 1973, those numbers were dragged down to 8-to-1 or lower. Lower compression meant a weaker, less efficient fire. This created a vicious cycle. Because the fire was weaker, the engine produced more unburned fuel. Because there was more unburned fuel, the smog pump had to work even harder to burn it off in the exhaust. To make matters worse, the way horsepower was measured also changed in 1972. The industry switched from gross to net horsepower.
Gross was the power of the engine on a stand with no accessories. Net was the power as it sat in the car, with the muffler, the fan, and most importantly, the smog pump. The results were a public relations disaster. The Cadillac 500 cubic inch engine, the largest passenger car engine in the world, saw its rating plummet from 400 horsepower to just 235. The American consumer woke up one morning and felt like their favorite cars had been castrated overnight. Next, the engineers attacked the ignition timing. To lower emissions further, they retarded the spark. Instead of firing the plug at the perfect moment for maximum torque, they fired it late. This ensured that the fuel was still burning as the exhaust valve opened. This was the final blow for engine longevity. Late timing meant the heat wasn't pushing the piston down, it was blowing straight out through the exhaust valves. To prevent the engines from literally melting themselves, Detroit swapped out the standard 180-degree thermostats for 195-degree units. Your engine was now forced to run at a permanent artificial fever just to keep the tailpipe clean. The irony was bitter and deep. These controls were marketed as a way to save the environment, but they effectively destroyed fuel economy. A 1970 Chevelle might have gotten 12 miles per gallon. The 1975 version, choked by a parasitic pump and late timing, dropped to 9 miles per gallon. Because the car was so inefficient, you had to burn more fuel to go the same distance. The fix was actually increasing the total volume of gasoline being burned on American highways. By 1975, the Malaise Era had reached its peak of absurdity. The Pontiac Trans Am featured the massive 455 cubic inch V8. In 1970, that displacement was enough to tear the tires off the rims. By 1975, thanks to the smog pump and a newly added exhaust gas recirculation, or EGR valve, that massive engine produced a measly 200 horsepower. The EGR valve was another Band-Aid. It took dirty, inert exhaust gas and shoved it back into the intake manifold to dilute the incoming air. The goal was to lower peak combustion temperatures to reduce pollution. The result was an engine that felt like it was breathing through a wet rag. By 1976, a 350 V8 that once produced 370 horsepower was struggling to put out 165. It was a 55% loss of power in just 6 years. This wasn't just a loss of speed, it was a loss of reliability. The smog pumps were notoriously fragile. They used check valves to prevent exhaust from flowing backward into the pump. When these valves inevitably failed, the hot exhaust gases would roar into the pump, melting the internal vanes and causing the belt to snap. When the belt snapped, the car often lost its power steering or its cooling fan, leaving the driver stranded. Then there was the vacuum forest. To control all these new valves and pumps, engines were covered in dozens of tiny rubber hoses. A single crack in a $3 hose could cause the engine to surge, stall, or refuse to start. Finding the leak was a nightmare that could take a mechanic hours. Consumer Reports eventually labeled these cars the most unreliable vehicles ever mass-produced. While Detroit was drowning in a sea of vacuum lines and parasitic pumps, a small company from Japan was doing the unthinkable. Honda didn't just bolt things on, they engineered their way out. They introduced the CVCC engine. The CVCC used a stratified charge system. It had a tiny secondary combustion chamber that ignited a rich fuel mixture, which then spread to a leaner mixture in the main cylinder. It burned so clean that it didn't even need a smog pump. It didn't even need a catalytic converter. The Japanese cars were cleaner, faster for their displacement, and 30% more fuel efficient. American buyers, tired of their stalling Chevelles and overheating Fords, began switching in droves. By 1975 and 1980, Japanese market share doubled, then doubled again. Detroit didn't just lose horsepower, they lost the trust of the American public. The resurrection finally began in the early 1980s, but the smog pump wasn't invited to the party. The arrival of the three-way catalytic converter changed the game. Unlike the early oxidation converters, these new units could handle all three major pollutants at once. But the real hero was the computer. The first primitive engine control units, or ECUs, allowed for closed-loop operation. A sensor in the exhaust could tell the computer how much oxygen was left over. The computer could then adjust the fuel mixture 1,000 times a second.
Suddenly, the crude mechanical parasites could be tossed in the scrap heap. Performance began a slow, painful climb back from the dead. The 1982 Corvette finally hit the 200 horsepower mark again. It wasn't the 1970 level of power, but it was honest power. It was efficient. It was reliable. Looking back, the smog pump era is a brutal case study in hurried engineering. The billions of dollars Detroit spent on belt-driven pumps, check valves, and vacuum switches could have funded the fuel injection revolution a decade earlier. They chose the fast way, and it cost them their global dominance. The 1970 Clean Air Act was a necessary piece of legislation. American cities were literally choking on their own traffic. But the implementation, the reliance on crude, bolt-on fixes instead of fundamental redesigns, created a decade of malaise that the American auto industry barely survived. What car did you own during the Malaise era? Did you have a Buick that couldn't climb a hill? Or a Ford that hissed with vacuum leaks every time you turned the key? Or maybe you were one of the people who removed the smog pump the day you bought the car. Share your story in the comments. Let's talk about the decade when Detroit lost its way and the long road back to power.